Okay, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to this week's Data Security Forum, Data Protection Forum. Where this week we're going to talk about GDPR Mythbusters. We're going to bust some of the common myths around GDPR. And if you follow us on LinkedIn, you'll have seen that we've been running a poll, and it's been quite interesting there, seeing that there's not a single myth which somebody doesn't believe. Um, and so, as I say, hopefully this morning I can eradicate those myths and explain a little bit as well, I think, about why these myths exist and why they persist. So, for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Keith Brown from Insurity. We are award-winning GDPR consultants. We provide training and consultancy to businesses of all sizes throughout the UK and throughout Europe, and indeed throughout the USA and Canada too. Um, so today we're putting the GDPR myths under the microscope, and I'm going to show you how simple it can be to make sure those myths don't apply to you. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about the top 5 GDPR myths, what the law actually says, why they spread, some simple compliance steps, and then we have time for some questions and answers at the end if we have any. So this is our journey today. We're hopefully going to send you away with some clarity and some simple steps that you can take straight away. So myth number 1 here in the UK. The UK left the EU, so GDPR doesn't apply. Oh, if only it were that simple. Um, GDPR does very much still apply because we have UK GDPR, which is encompassed within the Data Protection Act 2018. And to all intensive purposes, it's nearly identical to EU GDPR. In fact, I would say for your average business watching this, it is exactly the same as EU GDPR. There are a few technical nuances, but really they're not something that most people are ever going to come across. So if you're compliant with EU GDPR, you're going to be pretty well compliant with UK GDPR and vice versa. But you do need to be compliant with one of them, or maybe both, because if you offer goods and services to EU residents, then EU GDPR still applies to those people, even though we've had Brexit, even though we are no longer in the EU. EU GDPR still applies to EU residents, so be aware of that. Brexit, which seems like a lifetime ago now, but of course it wasn't. It was only a couple of years ago. Brought in new rules, but not no rules. So it's not a free-for-all. That the rules still exist, and as I say, they're almost exactly the same as we had anyway prior to Brexit. However, I will bring in 2 notes of caution here. The new Labour government is taking data protection really, really seriously, and they are bringing in 2 new pieces of legislation: the Data Use and Reform Bill and the Data Security and Infrastructure Bill. Both of those are now making their way through Parliament. They're at various stages in Parliament. The Reform Bill is currently being gone through line by line in the House of Lords. The Data Security Infrastructure Bill has just had its reading in the House of Commons, so doubtless will be going to the House of Lords soon. Government is keen to push these through at pace. And feedback we have from government ministers is that they are aiming to get them onto the statute, but by September, October this year. So by the time Parliament comes back from its summer recess, then they are expecting to be able to put them on the statute. But so they will be enforced before Christmas, I'm sure. And there are a number of new rules in those. I'm not going to cover them today. A, because not all of them are yet precise, because the legislation is still making its way through our Parliament. And B, because they really would take up one of these 25-minute training sessions on their own. So I'll look to do one of those probably, I think, in about 6 weeks' time, but not yet, because there's not yet enough that is known to be certain. But do be certain that there is going to be increased rules. Myth number 2 is that emails aren't personal data. You know, if all we hold is emails, don't need to worry about GDPR, do we? Well, sorry, you do, because if an email identifies a person, it is personal data. GDPR is all about identifying individuals. It's not just about names. If you can have a document which doesn't mention a name at all, but if from that information in that document or that email, you could identify the person that it is about, it falls under GDPR. I'll give you an example. Um, those of you who know me personally know that I have a disability. If I was the only person with a disability in my village, and somebody wrote in a local newspaper about the person in the village with a disability, that would be enough to identify me, even though it didn't have a name. So, be careful. It's not always about names. It can be inferred from information. And the general rule to accept is that if a reasonable person could calculate who that person is from the information that's given, hey, do you know what? It falls under GDPR. Also, be aware that work emails, if they're in the form of first name dot last name at company name, count as personally identifiable information. If it's just first name at companyname.com or last name at companyname.com by themselves, they don't. But first name dot last name counts, even though it's a company email address. And this is especially relevant in marketing, it's relevant in customer service, and of course it's relevant in HR, especially in HR. And these days I seem to be dealing with an increasing number of queries from HR consultants and HR departments. So if you know someone with an HR department, or you yourself have an HR department that could really do with a bit of a refresher on the rules about GDPR, then please do get in touch with us, because it's at insurity.co.uk, because it's important that we all work together to get these things right. Myth number 3, consent's all we need. No, because consent is only one of the lawful basis for processing data. There might be other lawful bases that are more appropriate. For example, it might be that you have a legal obligation to hold that information. If you have employees and you have a legal obligation to hold information about your employees, you don't need their consent. In fact, they can't give you their consent. And that's something we covered in one of these workshops a few weeks ago. So if you haven't watched the recordings of the previous ones, please go back and do so. If you want to gain access to them, please let us know, and we'll be delighted to give you access to them. And poorly obtained consent can in itself make you non-compliant, because if when someone gave you the consent, it wasn't clear to them what they were consenting to, then that consent's really not worth the paper it's written on, or the tick on the screen that it's given. You must be clear about what people are giving consent to, and consent isn't a free pass. It's actually one of the most fragile legal bases because it's easily withdrawn. The rules say that consent must be as easy to withdraw as it is to give. And so if all someone has to do to give consent is tick a box on your website, all they should have to do to remove consent is tick a box on the website. As soon as they tick that consent, untick that box rather, I should say, you've got a problem because you can't process their data anymore. Unless one of the other lawful bases applies. But if one of the other lawful bases applies, then why aren't you using that lawful basis in the first place? And if you don't understand about the lawful basis and the sixth legal basis, again, please get in touch, because it's a reason for having some training so that we can help you. Myth number 4, we're fine. We have antivirus software. Well, I'm tempted to say, well done. Having antivirus is great, but GDPR goes much further than that. It's about protecting data by design, not just fending off bad actors. Technical controls like antivirus, they're just one part of the picture. Yeah, of course you should have antivirus, you should have anti-malware, you should have all these good things. But in themselves, they don't make you compliant. Because GDPR also requires organizational measures. It requires you to have training. It requires you to set up access control so you know who has access to what. And it requires you to have documented breach procedures. So if you are unfortunate enough to have a data breach, everyone knows what they should be doing. And that is really, really important. So, please, again, if you're unsure on any of those, do get in touch with us at insurity.co.uk. And myth number 5, the ICO only investigates big companies. If I had £1 for every time I've heard this, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be sitting on a beach somewhere, relaxing, because it is really such a common myth, and it. Sorry to disillusion everyone, but it is total rubbish. Um, because fact check time. Small, medium enterprises, SMEs, charities, and even schools have been fined. When choosing what to investigate, the ISO doesn't actually care what size you are. It cares what the impact of whatever has happened could be on those people's data. So you might only have 5 employees, but if you've been putting their pay details on the internet for everyone to see for the last 6 months, you're going to get investigated just as much as the big company that might have released details of 40,000 people. Because the ISO is prioritizing the impact and the potential harm to those individuals. And the ISO is very active in investigating SMEs, especially in sectors like retail, education, and healthcare. Nobody is too small to be held accountable. I work as a site provider, and that theoretically, if you're a one-man band, you're going to be incredibly unlikely and have bad luck. You know, you really would be an example of someone who, if they didn't have bad luck, they'd have no luck at all. Um, because the ISO is probably never going to come and knock on your door. I can't say it will never, but probably never going to come and knock on your door. But if you're 5 people, 3 people, 10 people, 20 people, you have a breach that has impact, they're going to come and investigate. And one thing I will say about ICO investigations, I haven't been involved in a few, is that it's not necessarily the fine at the end that is the problem. It's the length of time they take, the questions they ask, the experts you then need to bring in. They're going to want to talk to your ICO, your ICO, your DPO if you have one. Like you may be using us as an external DPO. You might have somebody internal who's doing that role. They don't want to talk to them. They don't want to talk to your company directors. They don't want to talk to your accountant. They're going to probably want to talk to your leader advisors, if you have any, all of which cost money, but more importantly, all of which cost time. And an ICO investigation of a medium-sized enterprise might take 4 months because they're thorough, but they're not quick. And you've got that hanging over you all that time, and it's costing you money. Why do you want that? I would suggest you don't. So get the rules in place, then you don't have to worry about it. So these are all myths, and please believe me when I say they are, that none of them are true. Then why do they stick around? Several reasons. Part of it is from the industry itself, and I'm probably not going to make myself very popular with the first point here, especially since immediately after this, I'm off to Privacy Space, which is the data protection industry main conference in the UK this year. So if anybody's watching this before they go to that, you can buy me a coffee and shoot me later. But the first thing I'm going to say is that a lot of them has come from outdated training or advice. I see people still training with slides that they wrote back in 2018. And you shouldn't be, because the rules have changed. There's more case law now. There's more things to rely on. So, make sure whoever's doing your training is up to date. Another reason they persist is within companies, you can get the mindset of, well, it's always been that way. We've always done it that way. We've never had any problems, never had any problems. Why shouldn't we carry on doing it that way? Well, because it's maybe be illegal to carry on doing it that way. No one will ever. Someone said to me the other day, well, if it's so important, why isn't there more enforcement? Okay. Why don't they make the rules stricter? Okay. I said both of those, and I'm going to take an argument in a totally different field, but I hope it illustrates the point. There's a move here in the UK at the moment to change the law on people who've just passed their driving test to say that they cannot carry passengers after dark. until they've had their driving license for a year or something like that, I think is the idea. And the campaigners for that are citing an example of a very tragic example of four teenagers, one of whom had just passed their driving test, who went out on a Saturday night in their car and crashed into a tree at 100 miles an hour, and unfortunately they died. And that is very tragic. No getting away from that. But let's look at the fundamentals there. There's already a law that says on a single track road you shouldn't do more than 60 miles an hour. So that driver was breaking the law anyway. So if we had an additional law to say you shouldn't carry passengers, do you really think that accident wouldn't have happened? I'd suggest it would, because they're ignoring the law anyway. And the same can be true in the field of GDPR. You know, if people ignore the law anyway, what's the point of making the law tighter? Because they're just going to ignore it even more. So let's change that mindset. Let's get away from it's always been that way to it shouldn't be that way. And let's change it, and let's get things so that, you know, we're doing things the right way. Other reason, people get confused. And hands up here, I will agree that the law in some areas is confusing. Because on the one hand, particularly your marketing, on one hand you've got GDPR over here, and on the other hand you've got PECA, the privacy in electronic communications regulations over here, which we've covered both in various workshops that we've done here over the last few months. Again, please go back and look at the recordings if you've not watched them. But that confusion is strong. And that one of the things the new government is aiming to do is bring those pieces of legislation together. And I think that will be a big help. It will take away some of the confusion, or I hope it will. And the final thing is over-reliance on IT solutions, which I should have relied on a spell check because I just realised the spelling's wrong there. But over-reliance on IT solutions because at the end of the day, if you look into data breaches and GDPR breaches, the most common factor is not that IT went wrong. The most common factor is people went wrong. And so, yes, you can have IT solutions, you have, monitoring systems, you have recording systems, all that good stuff. Hey, if you want some of that, we can sell it to you. But by itself, it's not the answer. You've got to have your people thinking in the right mindset too, and that's really, really important. So hopefully that explains why some of these myths exist and why they persist. Because some of those myths have been around, it feels like, for time immemorial, certainly as long as GDPR has been around. So let's move from myth to action. Now we've cleared the fog, let's talk about some simple practical things that you can do to improve your own compliance. 5 quick wins. First one, and I know I keep on about this almost every session that we do at this, but it is so important. Map where your data comes from. What data do you have? Where do you keep it? Who uses it? Who is it about? And why did you hold it? Because if you don't know what you've got, you can't protect it. You don't know what you don't know. So make sure that you've recorded that. You know, what data do you have? And I'll go through it again. What data do you have? Where does it come from? Where does it go? Who uses it? Who is it about? And why do you process it? And if you've not got a strong why, my advice would generally be you shouldn't be processing that anymore. Review how you get and record consent. How do you get consent? Do you get consent on your website? Do you get consent on a paper form? Do you get consent on both? How do you get consent? How do you record that consent? If I came to you today, having given you consent 3 years ago, and said, when did I give you consent and how, could you tell me? And if the answer to that is no, then you need to look at your procedures for recording consent because they ain't working. So, again, the things that do. Update your privacy and cookie notices. Make sure they're up to date. I recently had a privacy notice where they'd obviously copied it from a template, No harm in that. Everybody uses templates to some degree, but they'd actually left in the bit that said square brackets, enter your company name here, square brackets. They'd not been through it. They'd literally just cut and pasted it, and that's not the answer. That's not a privacy notice. Come on, put some effort into that. You need to run, or you should run, staff awareness sessions. I did one recently, in fact, last Wednesday. And it was great. We had all the staff in the room. It wasn't a training session per se. We talked about our experiences. We talked about issues that they were having. I gave them all my advice, and it really, really worked. So if you want to run a staff awareness session and you'd like us to facilitate that, then again, please contact us and let us know. And assign a data protection lead. And I've mentioned in previous workshops why you shouldn't call them your DPO unless you really, really have to. And again, if you're not sure on that, go back and watch previous ones. So where can we help? We can help with hands-on support, or we can help with training, of course. We provide engaging staff training, and yes, we do get feedback because our motto is about making it fun. If it's fun, it gets done. If it's a bore, it's a chore. And so we believe in making our training enjoyable. We can provide ongoing DPO services if you need them, and we can review your policies and procedures whenever you want us to, because we believe GDPR doesn't have to be a headache. If it's fun, it gets done, and we're here to make that a reality. That's our whole reason for being. So I'm going to move on now to take any questions. Thank you for your time. If you're watching the recording and you have any questions, please do feel free to either message us on LinkedIn or to email us. And email address should be coming up in a second now. dtailinsurity.co.uk. Let's discuss any questions you have, whether it's about GDPR, whether it's about PECA, the Privacy and Electronic Communication Regulations, or whether it's just about compliant marketing practices. Whatever. Thank you for your time on this Wednesday morning, or if you're watching the recording whenever you're watching it. If you've watched the recording and you like it, let us know. Equally, if you've watched the recording and you don't like it, let us know, because all feedback is valuable. I want to know how to get this, that you get the most out of these fortnightly sessions. Don't forget, next week and the alternate weeks when we don't have a live session, we have our newsletter. Our newsletter goes out now to, I think it's just shy of 3,000 people. So please do that. As I say, this week I'm off to Privacy Space, the UK conference for data protection professionals. And doubtless, if there's any news from that, I'll be bringing it back to this session in 2 weeks' time. So with that, thank you very much. And yeah, that's the session all wrapped up for this week. Thank you once again for your time. Thanks. Bye.